Good evening and welcome. I am Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network. Tonight we have another webinar in the Family Room Live series with Dr. Chris Willard, who we can see has drawn a wonderful group of participants. I would like to give a special shout out to our friend and colleague, Nancy Siegel, who connected us to Chris. Thank you, Nancy. It's been a wonderful relationship. We'll introduce Chris in a moment. First, I thought I would just take a quick moment to show you the family room. It's now available for you to explore. The family room is an online space with experiences, activities, and resources that bring Jewish culture, values, and traditions to the relationships between grandparents and grandchildren. I'm going to share my screen and show it to you quickly. This is the family room. It's located on the Jewish Grandparents Network website. On the illustration or in the legend below it, you decide which experiences you would like to explore with your grandchildren. For example, the arts, perhaps gardening in the earth. There's play, there's reading room, family stories, and so on. To give you one example of the type of experience that we offer you, I thought I would show you a post, an experience from Chris Willard himself called Mindful Walking with Kids and Teens. This is one of the activities in the health and well-being destination. So you can take a quick look and you'll get a sense of the kinds of fun and perhaps meaningful experiences you can have with your grandchildren, with always a Jewish component. One last thing about the family room before we turn to our evening's presentation. It's asynchronous, meaning it's not live. You do the experiences in your own time when it suits you and your family members. Now, two quick notes, bit of housekeeping. If you have a question, please write it in the chat box. And I want to assure you we're going to be taking questions throughout. And we're not saving them till the end, just send them our way. And we're going to keep this informal, and I will present the questions to Chris as they arise. The second note is that we'd like to suggest that you make your Zoom view speaker rather than gallery. That will allow you to see Chris up close and personal. And you can find the gallery, you can find the view up on the top, very, very top right of your screen. You'll see the word view, and may we suggest that you switch it to speaker. Tonight, we are so pleased that Dr. Ron Wolfson will introduce our presenter. Ron is the Fingerhut Professor of Education at American Jewish University in LA. And he is also the author of 17 books on Jewish life. His most recent book is called Raising A+ Human Beings. Most important, he is Zaidi Ronnie to his grandchildren, Ellie and Gabe. Ron serves on the board of the Jewish Grandparents Network. And a little personal note, he is a mensch of the First Order and a friend. Over to you, Ron, to introduce Chris.
Thank you, Terry. Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Christopher Willard, a clinical psychologist, author, and consultant based in Massachusetts. Chris has been invited to more than 24 countries to speak and has presented at 2 TEDx events. He is the author of 18 books, including Alpha Breaths, Growing Up Mindful, and a new upcoming book, How We Grow Through What We Go Through. His thoughts on mental health have been featured in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, mindful.org, and CNN.com. He teaches at Harvard Medical School. Welcome, Chris. We're a bunch of resilient grandparents eager to hear your message. Take it away.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Thank you, Nancy, for making this initial introduction to Terry. thank you everyone behind the scenes. It's a lot of work to put these things on so that grandparents can show up on Zoom. So I appreciate all of the really hard work that went into bringing me here. And it's a real honor to be here as well. I just got to hear a little bit more about the organization, and just so incredibly cool. The network that's been created as people make friends and, all kinds of things. It's also really, you kind of joke, we've got 100 resilient grandparents in here. And that's actually the most important thing for cultivating resilient kids, is really to surround them with resilient adults. This is one of the things that we really know from the research. So I just want to introduce myself a little bit and then talk about just a few things that we can think about doing as we kind of try to cultivate more resilience in our grandkids and in our families in general. And so my main interest in these last few years has been mindfulness. So I'll talk a lot about mindfulness. And I'll really talk about mindfulness in a few different dimensions, thinking about how do we bring a little bit more of it to ourselves physically, to ourselves emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and all of these then cultivate more resilience in each of those areas, right? Because to me, that's really what resilience is. It's physical resilience, it's mental and psychological resilience, it's relational resilience with resilient networks like this one of wonderful people and communities coming together. And it's also that piece of spiritual resilience that I think often gets overlooked in aspects of our society, but it's something that's really nice about an organization like this one, where the spiritual and the cultural are what bring us together. And so I want to just think a little bit, this pandemic has been quite a time for a lot of us and challenged a lot of our resilience. And, a lot of folks saying, kids are resilient, they'll get through it. And they are, right? We know that, but it's also a very, very challenging time too. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I had just flown back from Chicago where I was doing a talk, and it was like March 12th, and it was March 13th that everything really shut down where I am in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Friday the 13th, basically, of March, that it shut down. I don't know if anyone noticed, but 2020 had 2 Friday the 13th in it. It was that bad of a year. This is the first Friday the 13th, and I'm sitting out in the yard with my kids, and I kind of look over at my wife trying to sound deep, and I say, the kids are always going to remember this time, this 2 weeks that we're going to have to isolate. Remember, it was going to be 2 weeks. And my wife looked over at me, and my wife's job, she's actually a historian of medicine. So her job is actually to study and teach about the ways that plagues and pandemics alter the course of history. So she's fairly popular right now, and people are usually like, well, why isn't your wife speaking? That's maybe more interesting, but well, you got me. So she was saying, people are always going to remember this time, like in 1,000 years, people are going to remember this time. Historians will look back on this pandemic of 2020 and 2021 and 2022. And here we are. And I think one of the things that's amazing, if we look through history, is that it is actually so many challenging times that are what create more resilience, right? And I'm not Jewish myself, but most of my friends are. Everything I know about Jewish culture and tradition, right? It's so much about challenges that created more resilience, challenges that created new rituals, that created new practices. And those practices are not just cool, important things culturally. They actually have a purpose of creating more resilience. And it's actually really amazing when we think about this and look at it. And I want to kind of just bear that in mind as I talk a little bit. We were chatting a little bit before this, actually, about the ways, I guess there was a talk recently about how stories and family stories build resilience, right? So really bearing all of that in mind, especially as we think about, the Jewish values as well as we go through this. I'll talk about some of the science and other kind of fun stuff too. But I was thinking about, I'm just interested in mindfulness. And there's this famous mindfulness teacher named KabatZinn. Some of you might be familiar with him. And he says, we've gone from human beings to turning into human doings. I was thinking about this at the beginning of the pandemic when everyone was like, running a marathon on their Peloton or learning 5 languages. And I was kind of not sure what to do with myself and thinking, maybe this time, this 2 weeks that I'll be stuck at home, is less about what is it that I want to do and more, who do I want to be? Like what kind of parent do I want to be? What kind of therapist do I want to be? What kind of teacher do I want to be during this time? Not just what do I want to do? And I think that's the other thing that these big, difficult challenges we face can do, is they can help us really clarify our values, right? To kind of make a joke out of it, the beginning of the pandemic was like, all the stores are out of toilet paper. And it was like, do I want to be the guy that takes the last roll of toilet paper? Or do I want to be the guy that checks in with my neighbors, right? And says, hey, I'm going to the grocery store. What can I get for you? And how do I want to model that for my kids? How do I want to model that for other people in my life? Because we actually know that these positive behaviors, generosity and kindness, they build resilience in us, and they're actually contagious. When someone witnesses an act of kindness, they're more likely to do it. And that's actually more likely to trickle out 3-4 degrees of separation from that initial act of kindness. People continue to act in those ways. So it becomes important for us individually. It becomes important for us in our families. And then it actually ripples out in larger ways to our communities, creating more kindness and compassion and actually more resilience as well. So this stuff is really contagious, these different resilience skills. So I know you maybe were kind of half joking, but it really is so important that we practice these ourselves. So I'm often asked, again, sort of, like, well, how do we create more resilient kids or caring kids, mindful kids? And it's actually really pretty simple. I know how we do the opposite, right? I know how we create stressed out, miserable kids. It's easy. You just surround them with stressed out, miserable adults, teachers, parents, grandparents, right? Other community members. But if we want to create more mindful, compassionate, and resilient kids, cultivate that in them, what we do is we surround them with mindful, compassionate, and resilient adults. And that's so important because our emotions and all of our behaviors really are contagious. And especially those more negative ones, unfortunately, like stress and anxiety. And so how we model handling that, especially in this challenging last couple of years, we all lose it sometimes and have a hard time, but we can come back and in front of our grandkids or our own kids, because they're maybe still learning from us, even though, they don't always ask us for advice like we might wish as grandparents, right? But that, we can say like, look, I'm having a hard time too, and I lost it a little bit. But here's what I did that helped me kind of be more resilient, get back to it. It was a bit of breathing. It was a bit of gratitude. It was a bit of this or that, so that we're really modeling and showing those skills. And what's cool about being a grandparent, I would imagine, is you can model that and the kids will do it with you in a way that they sometimes might roll their eyes at their own parents. Just like your kids probably still roll their eyes at you, but their kids maybe not so much. And so it becomes this incredible opportunity for connection, to think about what are these things that we can do together. And we know also when it comes to being resilient, to managing our most difficult, challenging emotions, right? These are contagious. The people we live with when we're managing our stress or practicing something like mindfulness, our partners say they're happier the weeks that we're practicing compared to the weeks that we're not. And people are getting along better in families when we're practicing mindfulness. There's better communication. People are happier. There's fewer accidents in the home. All of these kinds of things start to shift when just we manage our own emotions. It starts to trickle out and down and impact everybody around us. So resilience studies are really interesting. And of course, we know kids have been going through a hard time. Even before the pandemic, it's not the easiest world to live in. Certainly, I think, when I think about the Jewish community too, I think about like the rising rates of anti-Semitism and violence and how people feel under threat so often, right? And what does that do, to our feelings of safety? And yet we know when people have been through difficult times, have experienced what we call adverse childhood experiences, it's kind of a technical term called ACEs, little traumas, big traumas, things like that, right? What starts to happen if you look at those kids who come out the other side of it stronger and more resilient is that they all had one thing in common. And that one thing that they all had in common was that they had one person in their life, not the same person, by the way, right? But one person in their life who was there, who was caring, consistent, compassionate. And again, this is this incredible role that different kinds of family members besides just parents can play, but folks like grandparents or other mentoring that you might do in your life. The most important thing for a kid who's been through a difficult time is having that caring, compassionate adult in their life. That actually leads to resilience down the road, and those kids are way more likely to turn out okay. And the other second thing is actually being a part of something bigger than themselves that feels meaningful. Maybe it's a spiritual community, a cultural community, maybe it's doing service or something like that, but feeling a part of something bigger. And again, here in this, thinking about grandparents and thinking about culture and these things, right? These are two incredible opportunities to start to build some of those up. So I want to start to turn toward talking about kind of mindfulness and stress. And we know that kids are under so much stress. Little kids are under stress. Teenagers are under stress, right? They're facing things like, not just grades and, getting sleep in their social lives, but thinking about climate change. They're thinking about, right, their social media. They're thinking about school violence. They're thinking about financial, wreckage. They're thinking about the, damaged political system that we're in polarized times that we're living in. All of these things are building more and more stress in our kids, and it's impacting how their bodies work, how their brains work. And it's really shutting down actually their resilience. But there are some things that we can do that will actually teach them, that we can do together to help them build up that much more resilience. And so this is where I start to turn to thinking about, well, what are some of those things that we can start to do? So let's start by looking at kind of just the physical side of things. I mentioned this idea of mindfulness, which is really just trying to be aware of what we're doing as we're doing it. I could do a whole talk on mindfulness, but I don't want to hijack. We don't have that much time. And Terry promised to cut me off at exactly 7:59 and 59 seconds. So I want to make good use of my time, and I am the fastest talking mindfulness person I know. But how
and
can
excuse me interrupting you.
Yeah.
Please, will you include, since you paused for a breath, and I said I would jump in with a question when you do, a question from Karen at some point. Mm-hmm. How can grandparents who relate to their grandkids only on Zoom or Skype, in other words, virtually on a screen, strengthen their grandkids' emotional intelligence and security?
Absolutely.
At some point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll talk about that when we talk about our relationships in particular. So one of the things that we can do to help ourselves regulate our bodies when we're feeling stressed out, and it can be fun to do with kids on Zoom or in person, is actually just practicing some kind of basic breathing techniques. And I don't want to spend too much time on breathing because some kids are like, breathing is boring and all of that. But our breath actually, as we learn how to regulate our breath, we're regulating our body, which regulates our nervous system, our brain, and actually then can help our kids and grandkids and ourselves too, regulate our attention, our impulses, and our emotions. And when we can regulate those three things, our impulses, our attention, and our emotions, that's going to get them that much more resilient in school or in their relationships or in difficult situations that they find themselves facing. And so we can find ways to slow our breath down a little bit. We get it to about 4, 5, 6 breaths in a minute. And what actually starts to happen is that the whole nervous system settles down. The parts of the brain associated with emotional intelligence and social reasoning, insular cortex over here, and perspective taking and empathy and connection with other people, relationships, gets activated. The part of the brain up here, the prefrontal cortex associated with paying attention and managing emotions and planning things and all kinds of things like that, that gets activated. And the big emotional part of the brain, called the amygdala, the limbic system, that starts to quiet down just by actually slowing our breath down a little bit. And so with little kids, we can try to make this fun, basically. So my friend Daniel Retschoffen and I, we wrote a book a couple of years ago called Alpha Breaths, shameless plug, here it is. It just came out as a board book, but it's been out for a couple of years. And it's an alphabet book for real little kids about how to do some fun breathing that can help self-regulate. And this is something you can do on Zoom or with your young grandkids, and we'll talk about older kids as well. But A is for the alligator breath, which we can just practice doing a little breathe in, and then breathe out. Snap your jaws shut, breathe in, and breathe out. Breathe in, and breathe back out. And we're slowing our breath down and having fun and maybe doing some alligator breaths before dinner or before bedtime or story time or something like that, that settle us down, settle the kids down, and we feel more close and connected, and kids can focus better too. We have B for butterfly breath, and my 4-year-old daughter, who you'll probably hear screaming about not going to bedtime pretty soon, she's working on the sequel already. She's like, rainbow unicorn butterfly breath, right? But here's just the regular butterfly breath. You can add rainbows and unicorns if you want. Just breathing in, breathing out. Breathing out. You can do baby butterfly breaths. You can baby alligator breaths if you want to. My favorite, though, of course, is the hot chocolate breath for C. You can imagine we had a big snowstorm here last weekend. So the kids came in after being out in the snow and made some hot chocolate. We did some hot chocolate breaths to warm up. You can imagine you're holding this mug of hot chocolate. If it's too hot, what do you have to do? Blow out, cool off, and breathe in, smelling. Blowing out, cooling off. Breathing in, smelling. Blowing out, cooling off. Take a sip of your hot chocolate and set it back down. And kids will get silly, right? They'll have fun with this, but they'll get a little silly too. My own son, I took him to a conference before the pandemic. Got up on stage. I kind of bring my son up on stage, show everyone what a great mindful dad I am. Leo, come up here, show everyone some mindful alligator breaths. And he got up on stage in front of all these other fancy psychologists. He goes, so thanks a lot, son. You really did your dad proud on that. But we can have fun, again, by making up our own breaths with kids. That's something a lot of folks do, just having fun with that, getting silly, right? We're the grandparents. You don't have to be too serious. You can get a little silly and hand them back, right? But you can also do some of these practices to help the kids settle down. As kids get older, into the tween and teen years, right, they're maybe not so interested in Dr. Willard's hippy dippy, butterfly breath or something like that. Finding other ways of settling themselves, counting their breaths. One I like, just breathing in to 7, out to 11, the 7-11 breath. Lots of athletes use this. More and more athletes actually everywhere using mindfulness practices. But just breathing in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Back out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And up to 7. And back out to 11. And no one has to know that they're using this little technique before their SATs or before their college interviews or before they have to do that public speaking or whatever it might be that they're feeling like they can't do, but this will help them settle their nervous system. stay more steady for whatever the challenge is that they're facing. So that's some ways to regulate the breath, to regulate the body, but other ways that we can build more resilience physically and mentally, just getting exercise. And a lot of us didn't get a lot of that during the pandemic, although we started to get outside more, of course, in the last year or so. But things like exercise really are important. I have a good friend who's a neuroscientist, and I said to her recently, like, Sarah, what's the best thing you can do for your brain? She said, like, get exercise. It's like, well, what do you mean? Like, do Sudoku puzzles, do more meditation? And she said, no, physical exercise. It's actually the best possible thing you can do for brain health. Now, I have heard that grandparents are sometimes aging, right? And actually, one of the best ways to manage the brain-related kind of declines of aging is actually, well, one of them is mindfulness, but another one is actually just getting exercise. 20 minutes of walking a day, doing some of those mindful walking exercises I shared, things like that, right? Getting outside together, right? That is actually just as good as medication for mild to moderate depression. It's helpful for anxiety. It's helpful for focus for our grandkids who struggle with attention stuff. Right? It's helpful for sleep. So many ways that just getting out, being physical together, having fun, getting playful, these are also helpful for building more resilience physically and also more resilience mentally as well. Finding some ways to bring more mindfulness to eating, and we don't have time to get into that too much, but that's another place where we can just bring a bit more awareness, thinking about where our food comes from, noticing when we're full, having these conversations, and doing things also like sharing the ways that food has so much of a cultural value, right? Food is love in so many cultures, right? And talking about that, or talking about where these recipes came from, is another way of sharing family stories. When we share family lore and share family recipes and we cook side by side together, a wonderful way of connecting, especially with those grandkids who maybe aren't so verbal or so talkative, or boys oftentimes don't really want to sit down and have a conversation face to face, but cooking next to each other, right? Fishing next to each other, right? Doing a project next to each other, those kinds of things, just relax them a little bit and the conversation can start to flow. It's a little trick that I learned as a therapist. It's a really helpful way to relate to kids that are a little bit quieter, is doing an activity side by side rather than trying to have a conversation across from them in that way. And cooking and eating can be one of those activities too. Finding ways to get a little bit more rest, of course, and I'm sure your kids are complaining about how much their kids don't sleep. And during this time, it's been hard to sleep, but finding some ways to get a little bit more rest. And one of the things I like to do is this little exercise called the calm reminder. And it just stands for CALM, just checking in and tensing the muscles in your chest and releasing, your arms and releasing, your legs and releasing, in your mouth. And we can do this together. It's a little mindfulness practice, relaxation practice, really. You can find a comfortable posture, lower your eyes if you feel comfortable. And just bringing your attention to noticing sensations in your chest. Is your breath short and shallow, or is it deep and slow? Is your heart beating fast or slow? And take a moment, tense those muscles in your chest. Feel the tension and then just release. And shifting your awareness now into A for your arms. Your hands cold and clammy, or dry or damp. Shaking or still, and then just tense those muscles, squeeze, and release. Let the relaxation flow in. Down to your legs, noticing sensations there. Are they bouncing or still? And then tensing those muscles from your feet to your calves and thighs, just squeezing, feel the tension. And then just letting go. And then up to M for your mouth, place where I hold a lot of tension. And you can then just take a moment to squeeze the muscles in your mouth. And then just release. And as you release, just releasing goes into a smile. So CALM, tensing and releasing, chest to arms, legs and mouth, a way to just help yourself, help the grandkids relax a little bit, and something you can guide them through before bedtime if you're putting them to sleep, or even if you're putting them to bed, not putting them to sleep. Even if you're on Zoom, something like that. My mom died last year in the middle of the pandemic, and it was pretty tough for me and tough for my kids. But we did a lot of reading over Zoom. She would do meditations and visualizations and connections and a lot of these kinds of things with them just over Zoom until we were vaccinated right at the very end. We can also start to turn toward from more physical resilience, right? We know sleep also is so important for dealing with stress and dealing with mental health and cognitive functioning and all of that, right? But we can turn from the physical toward the psychological a little bit more. How do we build more mental resilience, psychological and emotional resilience? How do we teach our grandkids to do that? How do we do that together? It can come through conversations that we have with them oftentimes. Right? What is it that we choose to talk about? What is it that we choose to focus on? And there's a few ways of approaching this. One thing that I'm aware of is this idea called the negativity bias. Some people might be familiar with. The negativity bias means that we generally see things a little bit worse than they are. Right? We need that for survival. Our ancestors needed that for evolution. You got to look for danger wherever it is. But of course, if we are always looking for danger at all times, even when we're safe, right, we end up kind of more emotional and all over the place. So we can do things like practicing gratitude, appreciation. We can do these things together, and we can do them as a family, make family rituals out of these kinds of things. And it's not to say that things are great when things are not great, or that this pandemic has been great when it's obviously not been great, or that a lot of things going on in the world are good, or pretending that they're good when they're not good. It's about trying to notice that there's sometimes some good also happening at the same time. And that this is, I think, particularly important to acknowledge, like, yeah, there's some things that are really tough and there's some things that are good. I want to just share a couple ways to do this. Let's begin by I'll just invite you, take a moment and let's reflect maybe on your day, 7 o'clock where I am, 7:30, 4, should be aware of the time. Thinking over your day, what was a nice moment? Right? Or even yesterday, it doesn't have to be anything big, but maybe the sun was shining, although here it was 5 degrees, even though the sun was shining. Maybe it was you had a nice cup of coffee, or you got a nice text from a friend, or got to take a little walk outside, who knows what, good meal. Just reflecting on that, noticing how it feels to go back to that moment. Who was there? What was the scene? Noticing how your body felt and your mind. And then I'll invite you, if you feel comfortable, you can just share this in the chat box with the whole group. What was that nice thing? I'm going to write down laughing and playing Keepy Uppy, which is the game where you try to keep the balloon in the air with my kids. You can just put something in there, right? Look at this, cribbage, hug and a kiss when I drop them off at home. right? Feel free to share, right? This is never diminished by sharing our happiness or gratitude, right? Speaking on the phone with our daughter, right? Student we've been fighting with, right? All these little things. And it brightens our day. Like I said, like this is brightening my day, seeing these, right? Those weekly meetings with a friend, connections, things like that. Finding a movie, filming a movie with a 7 and 3-year-old, that's my age kids. Yeah, awesome. So these little moments, and we can also then share these with kids, share these with each other. And especially in like difficult times, it's important to focus, right, on those little moments of brightness, or we forget them. We have to make a deliberate effort to focus on those. Oh my gosh, Bluey is like the best show. Yes, Bluey is amazing. Yeah. And you know, these kinds of things. And with my kids, one of the things that's been amazing about the pandemic is that we have had time to actually do gratitude as a family. I'm home for dinner every night. I'm not on airplanes very much anymore. I'm practicing what I preach with my own kids. We've been doing what we call roses and thorns every night. A few roses, good things in the day, a thorn, and a bud for tomorrow, something we're looking forward to. Now, my son is 7, so I say, let's do some roses. And he says, well, let's do 100 roses so I don't have to go to bed. And I say, well, let's do maybe 3 roses. But it's like, you know, had a fun time with my sister. We built a fort. I got to have macaroni and cheese for dinner. And I got to ride my bike after school with friends. 3 roses, right? 1 thorn, well, you know, I don't know, it was really cold outside. But for tomorrow, well, I hope I have a good swimming lesson after school. Right? All of these help us to focus a bit more on the positive, a wonderful ritual to create with your kids, with your grandkids, right? Or continue doing, right? So just these kinds of practices of gratitude can be helpful.
Can I jump in? You spoke earlier in a most touching fashion about your mom. And I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you for sharing that with us. You spoke about, you know, talking to her on Zoom, and Martin follows up on an earlier question saying, extending an earlier question, what specifically might you suggest to grandparents whose grandchildren live thousands of miles away, who connect on Zoom a few times a week, but who only see them in person a couple of times a year?
Yeah. And I think there's so many things that we can do to connect and that also build resilience. Some of these kinds of conversations, talking about the positive and talking, you know, mindfulness is about being in the present, but also looking forward to the future in those visits, and talking about things like family stories can be so important. And I think also finding ways to play games together, whether it's in person or whether it's on Zoom. I was kind of amazed at how effectively, you know, my son's other grandparents, they send pictures of where they are, and they live in Vermont, and they'll often take a picture of the yard and say, I spy, and they have great animals. They say, I spy a fox. And my son and daughter are so excited to then look at the picture on the phone, the text message, like, where's the fox in the picture? Oh my gosh, there it is, right? And they're experiencing the same thing as their grandparents. Or to even just play, again, in person or online, just like in the room, like let's play I Spy. Like what's changed about you know, your grandparents' background today? You know, what's changed about the grandkids' room today? Noticing these things, these kinds of little games are great. And you know, when I was growing up, we had all these like time waster games of like playing Simon Says and Mother May I, and you know, 20 questions, I Spy. And then these days, right, what do kids do when they've got 5 minutes in the waiting room or nothing to do, right? It's like, get out the phone and play Minecraft or something. And, you know, to me, those games, they also were really teaching really important resilience skills. Playing Mother May I and Simon Says and things like that, those are actually teaching like impulse control. Manage your impulses. Don't jump before they say Simon Says. Right? Playing games like 20 questions or I Spy, these are actually teaching empathy, because they're actually teaching kids, what could my grandfather be thinking about right now when we're doing 20 questions? What's his usual pattern? What's his usual way of thinking? And it's teaching deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning and all these other really important skills just by playing a game with them. We're laughing together and playing together, and you can do that online, you can do that in person. And it's also teaching kids something besides just picking these things up when they want to be entertained. And it's also getting us to connect again. So finding these other ways to play together, like that, we think of play as just being play is play, right? But play actually has this really important role in all ages of actually building more resilience, building more social skills, and building more and stronger connections as well. So I think all of these are really important to think about. And then lastly, I just want to touch on one other thing about resilience in terms of our relationships. And then I'll start shifting towards some questions and answers as well. Yeah, never have I ever. Great intergenerational game. One of the things I think that, the reasons people don't feel so resilient, or especially after hard times, is right because things feel helpless and out of control, especially during times like this or challenging circumstances. And that is where actually creating new rituals often comes from. Again, I kind of think about, Judaism culturally, as well as religiously when I think about this, but challenging times that create new cultural practices and rituals that make us more resilient as individuals and as communities as well. I mean, a really silly example of this is like Halloween a couple of years ago, right? In the pandemic, people were like doing like the candy shoots, right? Because people they want to stay socially distanced. And then thinking, oh, candy shoots are great. We should keep candy shoots. Like, I don't want to walk up and down all those stairs. This is a great thing to keep doing. But that's a really kind of silly example. But again, keeping rituals going is so important. It's such an important way of creating, again, both that individual resilience and that community and cultural resilience, right, for an entire people. And the other things that we know actually really help with resilience is that idea that I mentioned of being a part of something bigger than ourselves, right? Man's search for meaning, right? And thinking about, what is meaningful? How can we share things? How can we do things that are meaningful, right? Spirituality really does that. And one of the things that creates an incredible amount of meaning is helping others. And as grandparents, of course, that helping your kids and your grandkids, that's giving you so much meaning at this point in your life, and that's building your resilience. But also sharing these kinds of things with your grandkids, helping them out so that they can do things to help others, helping them out when they're, if they want to go to the grocery store and get some things for some other neighbors, or helping them out with other projects, encouraging them to do different, tutoring for younger kids or doing a beach cleanup or something like that, that these kinds of things we know actually also make kids more resilient individually. And they also bring communities together when we do these. And we know in our kind of really fractured and polarized society these days that those community bonds are so important. Getting kids involved, right, with, whether it's with the temple or with other community organizations, right, it builds these stronger intergenerational bonds, which again, more resilient community, more resilient child at the same time, more connections that they're being held by, which is boosting them up and lifting them up so that they grow up far more resilient as well. So all of these kinds of things I think are just so helpful when we think about how do we create more resilience in our kids physically, how do we create more resilience psychologically and emotionally, how do we create more resilience also in terms of their relationships and communities? And certainly, how do we think about it in terms of more spiritual resilience as well? And so many spiritual practices, actually an absolutely wonderful book, looking at my bookshelf, and I don't see it, by a woman named, Lisa Miller, talking about the importance, and I know she spoke here already, right, about the importance of spiritual practices and what they actually do to our brains and our nervous systems and why they're so incredibly important. So I want to just pause there. I know I've got a lot of questions. I could keep talking forever, but I also want to make sure I'm addressing some of these questions folks have as well, and feel free to jump in and ask more questions as well. So
I'll read you one, Chris, if I may, that's a little higher up. And this one is from Lee Hendler, who is the co-founder with David Raphael of the Jewish Grandparents Network and the president of the board. Lee asks, what mindfulness strategies do you recommend for the things that are on our older grandchildren's minds, things like political discord, climate change, technology intrusion and distraction, and so on?
Yeah, I think that what mindfulness can do is it can help us manage our own big emotional reactions to these so that we can then think more clearly and maybe come up with some more solutions, find other people, right? We know that mindfulness and these kinds of practices, they really do enhance creativity and all kinds of thinking, to think through like, well, what can we actually do? What can we actually change? They help us to actually see in terms of things like consumption, right? Both economically and in terms of the climate, that we often need less than we think that we do. And they help us to see that a lot more clearly. They also help us to kind of figure out ways that we can step back a bit from social media. I'm happy, if folks want to email me, you're welcome to, but I've got a couple articles about how to more mindfully manage our social media use. And actually I'd hope to have a little bit more time to talk about that, but setting boundaries around our social media, not engaging in conversations that A, we don't win, and B, we feel much worse when we get in those political debates online. At least I know I do, right? It's taken me some time, but to figure out when it's time to step back from those and not have to get the last word in. And all of these things, I think. And they also, I think all of these practices can give us a lot more hope too, for what we can do, and make more clear how to discern between what we can do and what we can't do. But it's really challenging, and we see as our kids are facing so many incredible stresses. As again, it's not just the academics and college pressure and the usual social stuff, but it's also just these really big, huge global issues that they're facing, and it's a lot for their little brains to digest. But it's also, I think, I'm younger than most of you, but I think we probably all agree, right? It's going to be them who are going to be the ones to be able to solve it, to have the energy to solve it, to have the creativity, the drive to solve those. And the more tools we can give them, I think the more hope there is for all of us.
Thank you, Chris. Elizabeth asks, what do you see as the greatest challenges facing preschool age kids during this time, and the potential consequences? What issues or behaviors should we look out for?
Yeah, and I've got a preschooler myself. What I've seen is, what's been really hard is kids not, in a sense, being very socialized, right? They're not, a lot of kids haven't been in school, right? Or they're just getting back to school. They're not doing as many play dates. There's probably spending more time on screens, again, not because parents are bad parents, but just because parents are overwhelmed these days. So they're not doing things like learning how to share, right? Kids are, classrooms are buying one of everything. So kids don't have to learn how to share. I mean, just even those kinds of simple things are extraordinary to me. Or everyone in the family getting an iPad so that they don't have to share and pass around germs, right? Those kinds of things. So I think learning how to share in those basic social things, and it's challenging. I think it's important to stay safe, but also it is hard to read people's facial expressions with masks on and things like that. So making sure that we're also reading stories to kids, talking about what's going on in the stories. In fact, a really cool piece of research, if you read to kids, there's ways to really read to kids most effectively. And if you read stories to kids and you pause every so often and you say something like, what do you think this little girl is feeling right now? When we do that, when we read to kids, it teaches them emotional intelligence, and it teaches them to recognize emotions. And if you do that with 3-year-olds, there's some study that's like, they're more likely to share their snacks when they're in first grade. It's just really cool to talk about that, or to talk about other people's perspective. What might that character be feeling? Why do you think they acted that way? That can't substitute entirely for social interaction, but that can really help with the lack of social interaction that they've had, and help them catch up a little bit on reading faces, which has been a challenge during these times too. I see a lot of anxiety, basically though, to ask what's the biggest challenge, a lot of anxiety in little kids. And I think it's infectious. I think anxiety is about the most contagious emotion that we have, because we adults are anxious.
I believe that is it for the questions. If there's anybody who hasn't written a question in the chat and you'd like to unmute yourself, now's an opportunity.
Marshall, I'm very flattered by your comment.
We do have a question. Somebody had asked I'm scrolling through the chat. And somebody asked, will we save it? And I'm saving the chat because there are some wonderful ideas and some beautiful things that people are grateful for. Would anybody like to pose a final question, or else, Chris, we will, with deep gratitude, invite you to wrap up for the evening. Martin, would you like to go ahead, please?
Well, I was just going to say one thing I like doing with my grandchildren is showing them a large photo of something that's somewhat emotionally charged and ask them what's going on. It's like the old TAT test, thematic apperception test, but also then say, what do you think happened just before this picture was taken? And what do you think will happen after the picture's taken? And it just opens up a lot of discussion. It's more of a springboard for discussion than it is for, obviously, a right or wrong answer, which is impossible.
That's a great one. And I also just want to add, I've talked a lot about little kids and younger kids, and I think with teenagers, they can feel harder to connect to, but that's actually in many ways why cultures have rituals. It's why, right, there are bar and bat mitzvahs. It's because it brings the generations back together again at a really critical time before adulthood, as well as being a celebration of the child. It brings the community back together, reminds them of all these other people that they have there to support them, and reconnects, and also has rituals associated with it that also build resilience and build emotional intelligence and those kinds of things too. Someone was also commenting, talking with our teenagers, right, about what is the music that they're interested in and why, or the art and things like that are also such important questions to stay connected with them. And remembering too that teenagers, right, when we ask them questions, right, they roll their eyes at us. And I do all this fun stuff with my little kids, right? Someday I'll be like, what are your roses and thorns? And my son's will sprain his eyeballs because he'll be rolling his eyes so hard at me. But the reality is that when we've created this ritual where I ask him that question, right, he'll started to have internalized that, right? So he'll think about what he's grateful for before bed, even if I don't ask him. Or if I do ask him and he rolls his eyes, he'll still probably ask himself that question, even if he doesn't give it to me out loud. It's actually like a public speaking trick. If you ask questions in public speaking, it keeps people engaged because they can't not answer the question in their head. And if you ask kids questions, they might stonewall you outwardly, but they'll ask themselves that question inwardly. And that's almost as important as them answering it outwardly.
Can I say something as a
Please.
participant? Yes, so I am early childhood and 0 to 5 or 6. I do a lot of what we call floor time. Getting on the floor with kids, not just speech therapists, but it's way more than that, because we're really trying to go into the emotional, the motor, the whole developmental process with kids. And as you say, Chris, this is a very scary time for little kids. They're not getting the opportunity to play with each other and learn those things that we did as kids. They're not getting, because of the devices are so addicting to them. Today we were fighting with my 5-year-old grandson to take away the TV and the devices. And even if you sit and watch those things, TV, even the cartoons they see, it's all violent, it's all noise. There's not that natural connection. Yeah. So in our field, and we see this, it's really scary for the future, because the kids are living in a 2-dimensional world instead of a world where they're getting the interactions with others, looking at the facial expressions, reading the voices, all those things that are foundational for developing a healthy human.
Absolutely. And it's my hope also that, it's one of the things that's such a blessing and a curse about all these screens, and during the pandemic, it's kept us in touch, but it's also got us more hooked on them than ever, especially kids. It's like, yes. How do we, now that we're getting out of this, how do we detox ourselves a little bit and go back to, the normal before the pandemic with screens, I was not a big fan of either, but how do we get back to something that's balance, I think is really important. Absolutely. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Martin, did you have one final question? And then we will ask Chris to please wrap up.
Yeah, before COVID and hopefully after COVID, I always like doing this, especially with teenagers or almost teenagers. Have them, by chatting with them, responsible for in what way would you like us all to get together as your grandparents, you, and your parents? What activity would you like to do it? To give them kind of some ownership over selecting an activity.
Yeah, yeah. I think that kind of choice within limits is so helpful for kids, having that little bit of structure, but they feel some sense of autonomy and empowerment in it. You know, rather than go outside, right? It's like, do you want to play soccer or basketball? Right? It's a little bit way to kind of fool them a little bit into getting outside. Yeah. I see some comments about eco-psychology, which is great too, and a lot of good comments.
We, I think we're going to wrap up for the evening. Thank you, Chris,
Thank
for
you.
a wonderfully enriching conversation. We will post the recording in our Facebook group and on our website, and I will follow up with you all and those people who couldn't join us tonight. I will follow up with all the details, how to go check out Chris's website and how to join our Facebook group and so on. Chris, this was just phenomenal. We could probably have listened to you for another hour. I would also like to mention that the Jewish Grandparents Network is pleased to provide these live presentations. We do usually around one a month, and I think this one has been a highlight, and we provide these at no cost to our participants. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we deeply value your support, which helps advance our work. If you would like to make a donation to JGN, I put the link in the chat bar, and I will also put it in our follow-up email. And finally, if you'd like to mark the date on your calendar for Tuesday, February the 15th at 7 p.m., we will at that time be hosting an important event on teens and mental health, and we'll reach out to you with all that information. On that note, Dr. Chris Willard, I'm so glad that I know you now. And from all of us, we thank you profusely and wish you all the very best for a wonderful and safe and healthy year.
Thank you all so much. Stay healthy. Give your grandkids a big hug on Zoom or in person. And please stay in touch if you have any thoughts or questions. Just feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you again, Terry, and everyone at JGN. And thank you so much, Nancy, for the introduction. So stay safe and Happy New Year.
Good night. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.